Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about the impact of the migration of the Luo people to East Africa or the Eastern African region and how that changed the political structure of the region for good. And often this is not talked about enough. We never get to discuss how the impact of the Luo migration on the structure, social structure, political structure, and even economic structure of the region or the Eastern African region. That's Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. Now, East Africa has been occupied by people for a very long time. We never know for how long, but people have always been here. Now, but most people who were on this land were mostly, of course, they were people from different backgrounds and they spoke different languages. But for the most part, these people were related, even though history tells us that, oh, these people are very not related. They were very much related, despite the fact that they spoke different languages and languages that belong to different language groups. Now, when the Luo started coming down, that could be maybe, nobody knows for sure actually when that happened, but it is known that the Luo people came from the north, from Sudan, and they moved southwards, and that could be maybe 500, 600, 700, or 1,000 years ago. Could be somewhere in that range. But what is known that is when they came to the south, they found established monarchies and republics. And in particular, for example, in Uganda, they found empires like the Kitara Empire, which had been around at least for a while before the arrival of the Luo. Now, the Kitara Empire was huge. It covered much of western Uganda, but in fact, we can say maybe to the eastern side of Uganda and maybe to some parts of western Kenya today fell under the Kitara Empire. It was a huge empire. This is an empire that had been ruled initially by a dynasty called the Tembuzi, and then later on by the Pachwezi. Now, history here becomes complicated because different people tell the history of these people in different ways. The Europeans came and initially they decided to tell the history of this part of East Africa in a way that was very racial, because their view was that the Kitara Empire was founded and ruled by the Bahima people. And the reason for that is because the Bahima, there's a way they look. And the assumption was also that the Pachwezi were maybe possibly even European or Arabic or people of light skin. That's what they were driving at. That's what they were trying to say, or that's what they basically wrote down. And the reason for that, of course, was racially motivated, is because to them, the lighter your skin was and the more European you looked, the more intelligent you were, and the more potential or capacity you had to establish a very complex society like what the Kitara Empire was. Maybe the Pachwezi were light-skinned, it's possible, or they looked more, we can say, Caucasian than the rest of Africans. But that later studies, or later, the stories at least told by the people, do not give out that impression of, oh, they had this power over the rest of the group. In fact, in some stories, it is said that they were actually not that powerful, and other people were. Now, when the Luo came down or came southwards, they destabilized this Kitara Empire, and they took over the empire, and they started what came to be known as the Babito dynasty. Now, the Babito dynasty, of course, was Luo in origin, and it ruled over the Kitara, at least for a moment, and then it split it. There is a talk of the first Babito king of the Kitara Empire was somebody called Rukidi. Now, Rukidi had a twin brother who was called Kato. And he said after they took over Kitara, Rukidi became the king, as I've said. And then he sent his brother to what we know today as Buganda, where he was supposed to, of course, rule on behalf of Rukidi. But Kato comes to Buganda and he establishes a new kingdom, and it became Buganda. Now, this is very controversial, actually, because the Buganda people don't accept that that story. They don't accept that at some point they were under the Kitara Empire and that some Luo guy came southwards or southwest and established their kingdom. To them, they say they have been around for as long as Kitara was around, or maybe even longer than Kitara was around. Now, when the Luos became the rulers of Kitara, that is, they became the Babito dynasty, Kitara broke up, actually, disintegrated a bit. And then a new empire emerged called the Bunyoro Empire. Now, the Bunyoro was again ruled by the Luo, who became like the upper class in the society, and then the rest of the people were under them. When the Babito came into Kitara, Kitara were Bantu speakers. And when they came there, they embraced the language and they started speaking the language of Kitara, which was a Bantu language. But we can, of course, conclude that the king didn't come just by himself and became the king, that is Rukidi, because he needed force to remove the previous dynasty, the Bachwezi, and of course he needed a military force. And we can conclude that he came with a huge population of the Luo soldiers or Luo military, and he overthrew the Bachwezi. And of course there are different stories of how this actually happened. Well, but whether it happened through war or whether it happened through trickery or whether it happened through some form of divine intervention, whichever way you look at it, there must be a huge population of the Luo people who became part of the Kitara kingdom. And these people started speaking Bantu language, and they lost the Luo language. And of course, that became that. Now, Bunyoro rose to become one of the most powerful empires in Eastern Africa, actually, under the Babito dynasty. And so, and then of course we know the story of Buganda. Of course, I've said there is a story that Buganda was actually founded by a Luo who went by the name Kato. And if there are Buganda people here or watching, I'm not saying this to insult you. I'm just going by the different theories that are out there. It's possible that theory of a Luo founding Buganda is not accurate, and that Buganda was there before Kitara, long before Kitara. And now, the Luo, of course, did not just move and end in Uganda. Of course, today there is a huge population of people in Uganda, especially northern Uganda, who are either, we can say, Luo, or they speak languages that are very close to Luo, like Acholi and such languages. So, but those people moved even further than that. And of course, some of them found their way to Kenya. Now, I was reading a document by one Hobley, and this is a document that was published in 1902, and it talks about the different people who were around what we know today as Nyanza, especially the Lake Victoria, we can say, basin, or that part, just people living next to the lake. And even in as recent as maybe 18 something, there were huge populations of people who lived around Lake Victoria who were Bantu speaking. And when you look at different documents, you come to the conclusion that at some point, the entire lake was surrounded by people who spoke Bantu languages. That, of course, means if you're talking of Rwanda and Burundi, and then you're talking of Uganda, and then what we know today as Kenya, even Tanzania, all that land was occupied by people who spoke Bantu languages, the Awarimi, the Kisi, the Girango, there was different groups of people actually, but they spoke Bantu languages for the most part, the Suba, of course. But then the Luo come, and the Luo were a huge force actually. And when they come, they drive away most of these people, but not in the way you think. Like while they were a force, seems like they did not resort only to violence to try to get land. They seem to have been very diplomatic group of people, and very pragmatic as well, because when you come to Kenya, the region, the part we know today as Kenya, of course, in the Lake Basin, they assimilated so many of the Bantu-speaking groups into the Luo nation. And the most known, of course, example is the Suba people who were Bantu-speaking, and then they became part of the Luo nation, the Girango, and different groups actually. And And even the Kisi we know today, to a large extent, have a very big influence from the Luo people. And that can be seen in the names they give their kids, actually. And there was a huge interaction between the Luo and the Kisi people and the Kuria and those people. So the Luo, when they came, they basically either removed the people who were surrounding the lake who were Bantu speaking, or they assimilated them into their nation. And in a span of maybe 200 years, the lake basin changed greatly, such that maybe if you went to the lake basin, the Lake Victoria basin, maybe 17 something, all people you will find there were speaking a Bantu language. But by 1900, it was very hard. It's all people around surrounding the lake, especially I'm speaking of the side that we know today as Kenya. Speak a Luo language. Of course, the other parts like in Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi, those sides are still, of course, Bantu speaking people. Yeah, so the movement of the Luo people from the north changed significantly how this part of East Africa looks today. They changed it quite a bit. Those are my random thoughts.